Hi everyone, welcome back to Symbols in the Dark. I wanted to pick up on something that I had been doing before, and I wanted to do a little bit more of going forward, which are these psychological profiles. The last psychological profile that I did was on Moses, and the one that I want to do today is on Saul, and a little bit about why these psychological profiles. I think we often look at these stories and these characters in the story, and we kind of just read it, like a sequential story, which is fine and good. I think, though, in that process, we often miss these details about these individuals that allow us to construct a sort of profile that helps us not only be able to understand the character a little bit more in terms of, you know, why they may take some of the actions that they take, why they have some of the responses that they do, ultimately to be able to maybe see ourselves in that character or to be able to learn from that character. I think building these profiles and being able to assess gives us a better framework to better understand the story, not be surprised. And often I find that if you're able to make a good psychological profile with the information you have right in the beginning, you're able to then kind of not necessarily be so surprised of some of these actions of these characters and what they do. And it also gives you, and oftentimes, a sense of empathy and understanding, right? We last time we did a story on, or a profile on Moses, right? And kind of taking a look at, his upbringing, what happened, and, how someone could be wrestling with their identity given that there's a struggle between being a Hebrew and being from the tribe of Israel, and, all of that, and then being in Pharaoh's palace and being an Egyptian, that struggle between those two identities, all those kinds of things are insights that give us clues into these individuals, and ultimately give us a better insight in and of ourselves and the people that we interact with, and have a richer experience with the text. And so I think the first person, I had thought about doing at the time was Moses. And then the other person that came into my mind right away was Saul. There's so much on Saul, and I think perhaps David will be the next one. I think there's a lot to unpack in David and how he became the kind of person that he became. But I think Saul is a really interesting case study. As I read through the whole story and kind of piecing things and writing down notes and moments of this individual, it helped really piece together, like, why is it that they acted in the way that they did. Many of times is, we read these stories and we think, well, why do they act like that? They spoke with God and this and that. But we often remove the human side, the insecurities, the weaknesses that we all have, that I think play a huge part into how we react. So I think, if we want to start with Saul, we have to start before Saul, right? Because Saul is really a response to a question that should have never been asked by the children of Israel, right? Is they want a king like all the other nations. They want someone to to rule over them and to be able to go to the other nations on their behalf and represent. And so, God had warned them through the prophets back in Deuteronomy. He warned them what would happen if they got a king, but the people wanted a king. And, I find the parallels to our modern times not too far off, right? You can see this a lot oftentimes in some of our political situations where people are looking for this quote unquote right individual for this right moment in time. And they often put aside all of these other aspects that are important for leadership and kind of hone in on, we need someone to be very strong to do this, 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 and this, and that with other nations. And we often become surprised at the fact that they will do all of these other things when, they have shown, or we could see that their character would allow this to happen. And so, we read these stories, we kind of think that it is something so far away, so strange to us, but we see it too in how we act in our modern leadership. So I wanted to start by looking at what we see in the story of kind of his initial, what seems to be humility, right? Which takes us to 1 Samuel 9, 21 and then 10 and 22. So if you pay attention to the story, I think it's a question that kind of looms over a little bit in the beginning, right? When Saul says, "I'm from the least tribe, the humblest clan," right? And then he literally hides behind the luggage. The question is, was it real humility or was it fake, right? And I think the honest answer is it was neither purely genuine or purely fake. I think it's something more interesting and I think a little bit more dangerous than either of those two. And I think it's structurally defensible. And I think, I think my argument is structurally defensible, but I also think Saul was defensive in himself, right? Of who he was and his insecurities. So I think the first way of looking through that is looking at what I call this layer one of Saul. And the first thing that we can say is that the statement, it was real at the surface, right? The Benjamites, the people from the tribe of Benjamin, they were a small tribe. It was a small tribe. It wasn't purely just like a humble brag. It was a small tribe. And had been nearly wiped out in a civil war back in Judges chapter 20. So the inferiority had a real anchor, right? So he's not consciously lying, and I think we can hold on to that. And I'll probably speak a little bit quickly on this humble brag, right? I've heard it before, and someone that has also, immigrated, I've talked to other immigrants, and sometimes there is a little bit of this humble brag, right, of where they came from and all that kind of stuff. You have to be careful with that sometimes, especially when it is brought up intentionally, because I think that where it's coming from can be a little bit dangerous. So layer number two, when we look at that statement, we see that it was self-focused and not other-focused, right? A psychologist named Jessica Tracy and her colleagues show that there are actually two completely different things we both call humility. One they call appreciative humility. It shows up after you succeed and it points outward. You celebrate other people, you hold your status lightly. That's a real thing. The other they call self-abative humility. It shows up after you're threatened and it points inwards. It's shame-driven. And the whole goal is to avoid being evaluated, right? So Saul's humility is the second kind, all the way down. He's not saying, you deserve a better king. He's saying, don't look at me too closely because, I'm just this guy from the small tribe. Don't look at me too closely. So those are the two humilities. The third layer of kind of that I use to kind of interpret the story or build a psychological profile is the self-handicapping, right? Two psychologists, Edward Jones and Stephen Berglass, named a move back in 1978 self-handicapping. And it's when you build your excuse before the test, not after. So you announce in advance that you're at a disadvantage so that if you fail, it's the disadvantage's fault, right? And if you win, somehow, you're a hero who beats the odds, right? But notice the timing of Saul's self-deprecation. It comes right before he's made king, right before the great public test. I'm just from the least tribe. I'm just from a small tribe. That's the excuse planted early in the case that the kingship goes badly. It's a little bit performative, right? Is he aware of all this? Do I think he's super aware of this? No. But I do think it's part of who he was. The next layer number 4, and this one kind of ties the whole person together, the whole man together. It was vulnerable narcissism, not real low self-esteem. I want you to think about that. Vulnerable narcissism, because I think this is something else that we see very often sometimes in certain individuals. I've heard individuals sometimes say, I came from this and this and that. Sometimes you have to be careful with where that is coming from. And this is the most important distinction in the whole video, I would say. So I think, stay with me on this. Psychologists separate two kinds of narcissism. Grandiose narcissism is the loud kind. That's the obvious self-aggrandizing, the peacocking, right? But vulnerable or covert narcissism is it's mirror image, right? A person who presents a um, self efficacy, self being able to get things done and kind of pull themselves up, um, even fragile on the outside while carrying a hidden conviction that they're special, and a hair trigger sensitivity to any slight on that. And here's the proof it's not just low self-esteem for him. A man who generally thought of himself would not, a few chapters later, try to murder a teenager for getting a better song, right? That rage tells you that the self-regard underneath was enormous and brittle. Psychologist Roy Baumeister spent his entire career on this, and he put it bluntly as anyone else, and he said, threatened egotism rather than low self-esteem is the most explosive recipe for violence. Interesting, because that sentence right there, threatened egotism rather than low self-esteem is the most explosive recipe for violence. That's exactly what we end up seeing with Saul. Okay, the next layer, the hiding, right? So think about what genuine humility would actually look like in that moment. A genuinely humble man told that he's been chosen would step forward and say plainly, I don't feel worthy of this, right? And then serve anyway. He would not crouch behind the baggage while an entire nation stands in a field calling his name. Hiding isn't humility. Hiding is the avoidance avoidance behavior of someone who cannot tolerate being seen and weighed. It's really flight from the gaze. So here's kind of the synthesis of all this put it together. And I think it's really at the core of this entire profile. The man who hides at his coronation and the man who throws a spear at David are not two different people. And they're not a good man who went bad. They are the same psychologically in two different phases. And I think that's really important to do, to understand. Alfred Adler, 100 years ago, described exactly this engine when he said, a deep inferiority complex doesn't stay quiet, it presses constantly upward towards overcompensation. And the louder the eventual superiority will display, and the deeper the inferiority it is covering while making that display. Alder wrote this, he said, to be a human being means to possess a feeling of inferiority which constantly presses towards its own conquest. The greater the feeling of inferiority that has been experienced, the more powerful is the urge for conquest and the more violent the emotional agitation. That's very interesting. Very, very similar to Baumeister, what he was saying, Alder. Very, very similar. So read that sentence again with Saul in mind. The more violent the emotional agitation, right? Alder is describing in 1972 the exact arc from the baggage to the spear for Saul. The hiding and the violence are really the same wound, expressing itself first as a collapse and then later as rage. It's the same thing. So was it real or fake? Well, I think the cleanest way to say it is that Saul's humility was really a feeling, but defensive in its function. He really did feel small, but the smallness wasn't pointing him toward God or towards his people. It was pointing him at himself, protecting a fragile and secretly grandiose self-image from the one thing that couldn't survive, being seen clearly. That's what he didn't want. A humility that exists to avoid being seen will always eventually turn into violence against whoever sees you most clearly. And so for Saul, that was David, right? Okay. So let's get into another aspect of this profile, right? And we can kind of see a little bit of some of these first cracks. So 1 Samuel 13 to 14, the test comes pretty fast, right? So in chapter 13, Saul is at Gilgal. Samuel told him to wait 7 days. Samuel would come and offer the sacrifice. But the Philistines are massing. Saul's army is terrified, and the soldiers are starting to slip away into the hills. Day 7, and Samuel hasn't shown. And Samuel cracks. He takes a priestly role that was never his, and he offers a burnt offering himself. Um, it's kind of interesting, because the moment he finishes, of course, Samuel arrives. And here's the thing I want you to notice about this, because it's a pattern that will repeat until it kills him. Samuel asks, "What have you done?" And Saul doesn't say, "I sinned." He says, in effect, the people were scattering and you didn't come when you said, and the Philistines were coming, so I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. I forced myself. Right? That's the language of a man who has already decided and is now narrating his fear as if it were necessity. So every clause is a reason it wasn't really his fault. The army, the timing, the enemy. He's the only person in the story with no agency, right? According to him, that is, right? There's a name for that exact mental move. Jonathan Haidt describes the mind as the rider on an elephant. The elephant is the emotions, the intuitions, that decides where to go. And then the rider, which is the reason, is just the press secretary who explains the decision after the fact. Listen again to Saul's words, right? He says, "I forced myself." That's the rider watching the elephant move, right? The fear choose. The speech is the fear really takes over, right? The speech is the rider scrambling to make it sound like a reasonable decision, but it just wasn't. Yeah. So he says, that's what happened. I forced myself, right? There's no "I sinned." He says, "I had no choice." And then Samuel's verdict lands like a stone, right? He says, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, and the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart." Note the phrase, right? He sought a man after his own heart. It's the first time it appears in the Bible. And it appears here before David is even mentioned. So the replacement is announced before we even know his name. So that's really interesting. But now chapter 14, the honey, because it's really the same disease that Saul has, but just in a totally different scene. So in the middle of the battle, Saul does something super strange. He lays a binding oath on his entire army. "Cursed be any man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged on my enemies." But let's read the oath carefully, right? It says, "Until I am avenged on my enemies." It's framed as a devotion, a holy fast in the middle of the battle, but listen to who it's actually about. It's about Saul, right? It's a performance of his own spirituality, and it's broadcast to the troops. And it's catastrophic in its strategy because he's starving his own army in the middle of a fight. His son Jonathan, who, by the way, is the actual hero of this battle, the one whose faith triggered the victory, he doesn't hear the oath. He tastes a little wild honey on the end of his staff, and the scripture says his eyes brightened. He was strengthened. The honey is what the body needs. Saul's oath, though, forbids the very thing that would help. And then Jonathan, when he hears the oath, he says, he says the quiet part out loud. He says, "My father has troubled the land." Right? And here's where the psychology gets quite sharp, because the lot falls on Jonathan as the one who broke the oath. And Saul, knowing this is his son, knowing that this is the man who won the battle, will not back down, right? He says, "God do so to me, even more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan." So he would rather execute his own son publicly than admit that his oath was foolish. Right? It's very interesting. So this is what psychologists call the sunk cost trap of image management. Oh, and I really like this one, right? The sunk cost trap of image management. And underneath it, the external locus of control that psychologist Julian Rotter described, a person who experiences the cause of his own behavior as living outside himself, in forces that he can't be blamed for. So once Saul had committed publicly, once the oath is out there in front of the army, reversing it means admitting that he was wrong in front of everyone, right? And for a man whose entire self-image is built on the crowd's perception, being seen as wrong is more terrifying than the death of his own child. You have to really see this psychology of this individual playing out. So it takes an army overruling him to save Jonathan's life. The very crowd whose approval Saul was performing for has stepped in to stop him. And that's really interesting. So we have two scenes, but we have the same pattern, right? How Saul acts under pressure. Saul reaches for religious performance. It's interesting. I've seen this a lot in some individuals, I have a video on this on religious addiction. But when their image starts to kind of crumble down, individuals who are more associated in a religious inclination, they start to reach for this religious performance, right? But a sacrifice he shouldn't make, an oath he shouldn't swear, and a substitute for one thing he can't produce, which is genuine, an internal trust in God. The piety is loud precisely because the faith is hollow. Right? Okay, so what's the verdict, right? So now we come to the scene that more than any other shows us how Saul's mind actually works when he's caught. And I want to slow all the way down here because this is the most psychologically precise portrait of self-deception in the entire Old Testament. God gives Saul a clear command through Samuel: carry out a total judgment on the Amalekites, devote everything else to destruction, don't keep the plunder. Very clearly, don't keep the plunder. But what happens? Saul wins the battle, and then he disobeys. He spares Agag the king, a trophy for him, and then he keeps the best of the livestock, and the detail is everything, right? Before he even goes to meet Samuel, he stops at Carmel, and verse 12, it says, he sets up a monument for himself. A monument to himself, right? Have you ever met individuals when, that they set monuments to themselves? Need I say more? He sets up a monument to himself after disobeying. This is the first and only self-monument in his whole story. And it comes at the peak of his failure, which is quite interesting. And I think it's not incidental. It's a man whose disobedience and whose grandiosity are the same gesture. Then Samuel comes, and watch the choreography, right, of a guilty man beat by beat, because it's a masterclass in how human mind protects itself from the truth. Just beat one, denial. Right? So Saul walks straight up to the prophet and says, "Blessed be the Lord blessed be you to the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." I have performed the commandment of the Lord. Okay. He says, I have obeyed completely, right? While the stolen Amalekite sheep are literally, making their sounds in the background. He has so thoroughly rewritten reality in his own head that he can stand in front of a man who knows, and and the live animals are like right there, and just declare what he said, right? I've experienced this before with individuals where the evidence is right there. This is what they have done. This is what they have said. The proof is in the pudding, but the denial, because it is a rupture on their self-image. Psychologists call this self-deception or motivated reasoning. He isn't only lying to Samuel, on some level he has convinced himself. So that's beat one. But beat two, Samuel presents the evidence. He says, what is then the bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen that I hear? It's not it's not even just it's not like a theoretical question, right? It is, it's really like, explain that noise, right? So explain this message, explain this, right? Um, that's really interesting. So the evidence is right there. Beat 3, it's that reframe, right? And this is the move you specifically and always want to name when you see individuals do this, because it's the most human and most slippery thing that that Saul does. And he does this in verse 15. He says, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice it to the Lord your God." Incredible, right? Yeah. Beat number 4, Samuel names, Samuel, he names the disease, right? It's perfect. Verse 22 and 23, "Has the Lord a great delight in burnt sacrifices and offerings, as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, for rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. To obey is better than sacrifice." Right? And beat number 5 is that confession, and or seemingly, or the confession that isn't one, right? So, Saul finally says it, "I have sinned." But listen to the whole sentence. He says, "I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord your God, because I have feared the people and obeyed their voice." So let's just like think on that for a second, right? I have feared the people. That's the key to everything. Yes, I sinned because, right? That's the skeleton key to the entire man. I feared the people. He admits the sin and, in the same breath, blames the people for it. I sinned because they made me. That phrase, "I feared the people," is a clean description of what psychologist Mark Leary calls the sociometer. Leary's theory is that self-esteem isn't really about how you feel about yourself, it's an internal gauge measuring how accepted you are by the group. Most of what looks like protecting your ego is actually protecting your social standing. And you can see this in a lot of situations, right? So Saul has no inner reading at all. His entire self-esteem is gauged and it's wired to the crowd, so that when the people pressured him, the needle moved and he obeyed them over God, and then named it out loud, "I feared the people," right? Then, of course, we have the spirit that departs from Saul, right? Okay, so the spirit departs, right? God sends Samuel to anoint the next king, and he warns him not to be fooled by appearance. Man looks at the outside, but God looks on the inside. That's where we get that phrase from. And then the chosen one is David, the youngest, the overlooked, out in the fields with the sheep and not even invited to the lineup, but the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And then verse 14, it says, "Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him." So you have these two motions back to back, right? The Spirit of the Lord comes upon David, and then you have the Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul at the same time. And something darker moves in. Now, what is the evil spirit from the Lord? This is one of the most debated lines in the Old Testament, right? And I want to treat it honestly, because I think the answer is richer than, either purely supernatural or, purely clinical reading. I think it's something else, right? First, the Hebrew. The scholar David Tizmura argues that the grammar doesn't quite say an evil spirit the way we hear it. The construction points more toward a spirit that causes harm. The spirit's effect is evil, not necessarily its nature, right? It's the same Hebrew logic used when God hardens Pharaoh's heart. That debate around that as well. And the ultimate cause is attributed to God, who is sovereign over everything, even as a real human process plays out underneath. And here's where the symbolic and the psychological kind of meet, and I think this is what this channel is about, but I think it's important to see this, because when the integrating center of a man, the thing that orders his soul departs, that's that integrating center, what's left is not neutral. You would think that maybe what's left is neutral, but it's not. The chaos that was held back comes flooding in. In Jungian language, when there's no longer a higher principle integrating the personality to the shadow, all the rage and the fear and the self-deception Saul never faced stops being something that he represses and becomes something that drives him. Now he's being entirely driven by this thing, right? When that integrating center is not there. And so not only does it drive him, but it goes autonomous. It runs him. Jung put it like this: everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the darker and denser it is. So the more years Saul spent refusing to face his own fear, his own envy, his own capacity for violence, the darker and denser the shadow grew. And until the moment that the integrating center departed and it finally had run out of the house. And I think that's what you see happening here. So is it a demon? Is it depression? Is it a natural consequence of a soul that evicted God? The text, I argue, refuses to let you separate those. There's a reason scholarly literature on Saul reads like a psychiatric chart. Depression, paranoia, what some argued looks like the aftermath of years of combat trauma, possibly bipolar features. All of that is in the text. And so is the theology. So Saul is a man being dismantled, and the dismantling is at once spiritual and psychological, because in a human being, those are never really two separate things. And I think that's important to note. And then the cruelest irony in the whole story, who do they bring in to soothe the tormented king with music? A young harpist named David. The very man who is replacing him is the one who can calm him. David plays, and the darkness lifts for a while. The cure and the threat are now in the same person. And this is where we get into, all those situations. I'm going to sit back a little bit more now, but this is where you get into the whole envy and the spear situation, right? David kills Goliath, and on the road home, the women come out singing. Saul has struck down his thousands, but David his 10,000s. It was probably just a song. The Hebrew poetry doubles its numbers for rhythm. It likely wasn't even meant as an insult, right? But Saul hears it as like a death sentence, right? They have ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed thousands, and what more can he have but the kingdom? And then verse 9, one of the saddest lines in the scripture, and Saul eyed David from that day on. And this is envy in its purest clinical form, right? And I think it's a very powerful insight, right? Saul's whole identity ran on the crowd's approval. So when the crowd's praise shifts, even a little, even in a song, it doesn't just disappoint him, it threatens his entire existence. Because he never had an inside. It was never there. He was all outside this whole time. So a rival who draws more applause isn't a rival. For him, it's annihilation. It's the end. This is the exact moment to name what we set up earlier. Remember, we talked about Baumeister, right? And threatened egotism, not low self-esteem, how it's an explosive recipe for violence. Well, watch how perfectly this song fits it. If Saul truly had low self-esteem, a song praising someone else would just confirm what he already believed. And he'd shrug. He'd be like, okay. Instead, it triggers this murderous rage, which only happens when a high but fragile self-image gets publicly punctured. Baumeister's words, aggression is a means of defending a highly favorable view of self against someone who seeks, even unwittingly, to deflate it. The women weren't trying to deflate Saul. It doesn't matter. The fragile self heard a death sentence in a wedding song, right? It's it's really destructive. And I think there's something even, I think maybe even deeper than the envy, um, that we can kind of look to. Um, Sometimes we catch our desires from models, people we admire and imitate, right? But when the model gets too close, he becomes a rival, and then an obstacle, and then the original goal vanishes, and all that's left is rivalry itself. And I think that's Saul David, right? That's that relationship. David started as Saul's instrument, his musician, his armor bearer, his champion. But the moment the song made David the model of a warrior king, Saul was supposed to, you know, if, well, I would say the song and that whole situation modeled like, well, this is what a warrior king is, right? And for Saul, right, this for him, like this triggered this, um, this is the model, and now the model becomes the obstacle that needs to be destroyed. Instead of accepting that model, he saw it as something that needed to be destroyed, which I find very, very interesting. So by the time that Saul is chasing him through the wilderness, the Philistines, the actual enemy have been completely forgotten, right? You have this whole scene where he's chasing David, and it's like the Philistines are they're attacking them, but here he is chasing David. When the actual enemy, who was the Philistines, is completely forgotten, it's only the rivalry, that person, who remains. Very, very powerful. I think, there's a symbolic reading here. I love I love how Jonathan Pageau kind of pieces some of these kinds of things together, because David is the musician, the shepherd, the one who flows and moves and adapts. He adapts. He's alive, dynamic. He's he's just this very composed kind of figure. And Saul's impulse is to pin him to the wall, to fix him, right? To freeze the living thing in a place like an insect in a display case, right? It's kind of ironic and symbolic in a way that he's trying to pin him to a wall. That beautiful thing. And I think that's the instinct of the tyrant. When you encounter something alive that you can't control, you try to nail it down, and it never works. David evaded him twice. And so the rest of the story, there's more to say, and I think maybe there could be another part of all this. But what does Saul show us, right? And I think Saul's root sin was not the unlawful sacrifice, or the spared king, or even the murders. Those were all symptoms. The root was named in a single line. He confessed himself, "I feared the people." Aristotle would have called this Saul's hamartia, say it properly. The tragic flaw, the missing of the mark, right? And an otherwise great man that drives the whole reversal of fortune. And here's the detail worth knowing. That word, hamartia, is the very Greek word in the Old Testament that it uses for sin. The missing of the mark. It's funny how he tries to pin him to the wall, and he misses the mark to pin that thing which is right. And it's the tragic flaw in the biblical idea of sin. At the root, it's the same concept, right? Falling short of what you were made to be. Saul is the Bible's first true tragic hero. Great, chosen, flawed, and undone by his own one weakness. It's the fear of the people. I feared the people. Proverbs 29 verse 25 says, "The fear of man is a snare." but whoever trusts in the Lord is saved. Saul is what the fear of man looks like when it's allowed to run its whole life. And identity built entirely on the outside. A self that exists only in the eyes of the crowd. And a man like that cannot repent, that cannot, take accountability, a self that exists only in the eyes of the crowd. Repentance for an individual like that means caring more about what's true than how you look. And that's the one move he was never able to make. So the question Saul leaves us with is just this, and it's worth sitting in, thinking about. When the song changes, when the crowd starts praising someone else, what's left of you? And if the answer is nothing, you already know. You already know what the outcome of that is going to be. So if this resonated with you, I have other episodes that I'm working on. Or if you just found this interesting, I have other episodes that I like to work on, the psychological profiles. I think, as I mentioned, we are going to do David next. The psychology of the man of God after God's own heart. We're going to talk about that a little bit. What made David really different from Saul? So thank you for joining me once again on Symbols in the Dark.